FP&A is one of several functions that falls under the purview of the CFO, right? And a big part of the reason is they typically have the best understanding of what's happening across accounting, tax, treasury, and because of this, they're able to coordinate all this info in terms of how it actually impacts our forecasts, right? And they're senior enough to be able to push and challenge other leaders in the business to ensure that forecasts, budgets, etc., that these are taken seriously, and that these other business leaders are held accountable if they're not living up to their responsibilities in the role, right? And so, for example, when I was at both Facebook and Hotwire, we worked very, very closely with both the accounting and the business operations teams, as these are the main sources of the information that we are using. Right? And so we needed to know what was happening, whether there were, one-off or non-recurring items that we needed to exclude, and how any upcoming reporting changes, might affect our forecasts, right? In Hotwire, which is owned by Expedia and which owns several different travel brands, we also interacted somewhat often with, our corporate dev team. So this kind of group over here, who typically what they do is act as a kind of a consolidating function for the corporate entity. So they would take information from us at Hotwire, from other brands, and then kind of roll that up and say, okay, well, what does that mean for the overall corporate entity? Other departments in finance, these are going to depend more on the size and the nature of the company, right? So if you have a large public company, you're probably going to have an internal audit function that's also going to report into the CFO. You're likely to have more of a kind of tax and treasury team. Since you're going to be paying more in taxes, you can afford to have your own tax team, making sure your filings are going in time, you're not overpaying or underpaying your taxes, that you're issuing debt or issuing equity at the right time when rates are good, as well as having more of an investor relations type team that's going to face the public investors and provide things like earnings presentation, set up the earnings calls with investors and with equity research analysts and all that. Right, and so you can see FP&A really sits right at home under the CFO, because this is where we're getting all of our information from, and because the CFO is really is able to help coordinate and kind of guide FP&A in making sure that we're sending the right signals to the business. Now, it's important to note that the size of the organization is going to have a very large impact on the size of the FP&A function. And so for early stage companies, they might have only one or two very experienced finance professionals. Right? While a large public company can easily have teams of over 100 professionals. Right? Expedia itself had hundreds of FP&A professionals, while the smaller Hotwire standalone brand had only 7 to 10 employees in the entire FP&A function. Now, within finance and FP&A, there are two main structures of organization. Right? So the first is a functional organization, where FP&A is a discrete department within the overall finance organization or within the overall business. And so individuals typically cover different areas of the business for more of a centralized support function. Right? The other option is more of a product, division, or geography type breakout. And in this case, FP&A is interspersed in the underlying teams within the business. Right? And so then typically we'll have more of a dotted line reporting relationship back to some central heads of finance that are responsible for coordinating and aggregating information across each of the different kind of divisions that FP&A is embedded in. So which of these approaches your company utilizes is going to depend more on the size, the strategy, or the particular needs of the business. Right? So let's take a look at an example of a functionally organized FP&A team. In this case, we'd say this is a small to mid-sized company. It's pretty lean. The team structure is relatively straightforward. This is pretty similar to the type of organization that I had at Hotwire. And so, just as an example, this team on the left here, this might be responsible for managing operating expenses or headcount or supporting CapEx. And so, we'll dig in a little bit more depth what each of these roles are going to be responsible for in a little bit. But I just wanted to quickly point out a few things about how the FP&A team is set up in terms of this reporting, right? And so as we're working through this, I'll talk about that. So your manager, you'll notice here, this manager has, just one senior analyst that's reporting to them. In this case, you have the manager with a direct report to a senior analyst who also manages an analyst. This manager might even, in a lot of cases, directly manage this other analyst. So it's a pretty small team, a little bit more of like a flat, you'll hear it called as a flat kind of team structure where everybody's working together a lot, right? It's not a very, very hierarchical function. And so the way that these teams are going to work together is going to depend on what specifically they're working on, right? So as I said before, let's say this is, potentially, OpEx and headcount, and over here, maybe this is more, revenue, we'll say, like volumes and margins, right? And so in this case, you'll have kind of this, the manager is going to be responsible for overseeing the overall production of the team. And so making sure that OpEx is being delivered according to the deadlines that are necessary, that somebody is tracking and making sure that all the reports are getting out for the headcount reports. And then typically the manager and the senior analyst would be splitting some of the duties, right? And so the manager might be working more closely on headcount while the analyst here is working on OpEx, but the manager would be supervising their work. And you might even have this senior manager over here kind of doing a little bit of review on what the manager is doing, right? But the manager is ultimately responsible for trying to make sure that the OpEx and the headcount stuff gets delivered, right? On the the revenue side, this manager is going to be coordinating both the volumes and the margins, and maybe they're a little bit more involved in let's just say the volume piece, because that's a little bit more complex, or there's a lot more moving pieces, right? And so this side of the team here might be a little bit more on volume, and then this side over here might be a little bit more in terms of margin focus. And so you can see how this type of structure might function, right? This is just an example. The way that it's set up is going to depend, from organization to organization. But this is kind of a general sense of how it would look, right? And so then moving up here, we'd have, the senior manager would be coordinating all of this, and probably helping out quite a bit on some of the more complex areas within revenue or within operating expense and headcount. And then the director of FP&A here is really just making sure that the overall plan or forecast or budget or whatever is coming along as intended. It's meeting deadlines. They're the ones that are going to be communicating up to the CFO how things are going, if issues are arising, what they are, what the plan is to address them. And so that's kind of just the general way that this type of a team structure might be set up. All right, so what about the divisional FP&A organization we talked about? Right. So here we have an example of what more of a divisional FP&A organization structure might look like, and this is probably more typical of more of a mid to large size company rather than something startups probably would not be organized this way. But you'll see each of the division here has its own management. And then there are kind of smaller FP&A teams that are embedded directly into each of the divisions. So we'll see here this FP&A team kind of works and supports this specific division. This one here works on this division, and so on, right? And so this way, the FP&A team, because they're working with a specific division, they're able to provide a higher level of support to the business managers of each of those specific divisions, right? Now, in order to coordinate overall FP&A efforts, you might have kind of a centralized function, but you can see here it's kind of pared down compared to what we saw in our last example, even though there's a much larger FP&A team overall, right? And this is because rather than getting really detailed in what's going on with this division's revenues and this division's headcount and this division's OpEx, here they're really just kind of coordinating the work of each of the different individual FP&A teams that we have here. And so for that reason, it's a little bit more pared down, right? And so you can see the actual makeup of the FP&A organization kind of aligns more with the division level. And this is why this is called a divisional FP&A organization structure. Okay. The couple of examples that we just walked through really highlights, what are the most typical structures, but the right setup is really going to depend on your specific organization and what works the most, right? As I mentioned, Hotwire, we had more of a functional structure where we all sat within FP&A, but we each had our different areas of focus and our different areas of accountability. At Facebook, there were FP&A teams that sat and worked directly with, the facilities teams, the R&D and infrastructure teams, the advertising teams, et cetera. And so it had a little bit more of a divisional lean in nature, right? And in that way, each of those FP&A teams were able to focus and specialize a lot more in their particular roles, right? And they were able to develop much closer connections with the departments and the functions that they were supporting, okay? So in the next one, we're going to dive into a little bit more into the FP&A career path and how that changes over time. So let's go ahead and get to it.